The long road promised very little to the mercenaries. The sky had grown murky and unfriendly as they proceeded on, and a light rain had fallen for a short while. Now, as dusk fell, there was simply a thick, oppressive fog that fell upon them at a pace to match Rosier's descent for the night. The merchant's wagon began to slow at long last. Elias's legs were roaring in pain. They had been walking for most of the day, eating as they moved. Their merchant contractor had shown little interest in stopping until now. The incessant creak of the wagon's back wheel slowed and eventually stopped. For a moment, Elias took in a calm, moaning wind. For a split moment, there was serene calm. No chattering, no creaking, no shouting, just the cold breeze.
"Time to camp for the night, my friends,"
their portly contractor's voice shattered the peace. Elias yawned. The mere mention of camp calmed his muscles. He unlatched the heavy strap that wrapped around his chest piece, and his bedroll fell to the ground. He glanced about, noting that his mercenary compatriots were following suit. It seemed their client would not be supplying them with tents this night. As the soft object hit the ground, its strap unlatched, and it rolled out, as if to invite the young man to a night's rest. The invitation was most welcome. He unfastened a bracer, and his eyes glanced up to see the Acciari woman walk past him toward the nearby woods. He noted that she did not have any apparent field bed, and immediately felt a wave of suspicion. "Where's your bedroll?" The woman's purposeful pace stopped, and she turned to meet his gaze. "I don't have one," she shrugged. "I will use the comfort that the woods supply me with. Besides, given my comrades in arms' distaste for my kind, I'm probably going to be safer further away from them." Elias had to process this for a moment, and conceded, "That makes sense." He paused, scratching his head. He glanced at the band of mercenaries closer to the wagon, and then back to the Acciari woman. "Just resting, are you?" he asked with none too subtle suspicion. The woman responded in a taciturn tone, but with a clear expression of offense. "Of course I need to rest too, Thurlow." Elias simply nodded in habitual reaction as, nearly immediately, the Acciari walked off into the woods. His muscles slowly came back to a resting state, and he sighed. His bedroll beckoned. The young man took a moment to remove his boots, bracers, and greaves, deciding that it would be far too much effort to remove his cuirass and leggings, and slid into his bedroll. With the warm embrace of his field bed against the cold, harsh night, he felt a welcome touch of much-needed rest. He closed his eyes and felt his consciousness drift away. It felt as though Elias's eyes had just closed when he heard the sound. The sound built and swirled within his murky, half-awake mind. It shifted and grew until realization hit him as to what it was. It was the sound of metal puncturing wood. He shot out of his bed, the sharp realization waking him quite effectively. Dreary eyes shot to and fro, eventually falling on the wagon itself. At this point in the night, it was a nigh indiscernible silhouette pressed against a wall of fog laid before him. He could see movement in the fog, and eventually heard a familiar voice.
"We're being attacked! All yous get up and get your weapons ready!"
shouted the familiar voice of the ox. Pinhole-white eyes flashed in Elias's waking vision. He let forth a shuddering breath before quickly re-equipping his boots, bracers, and greaves, grabbing his sword and rushing to the wagon. As mist thinned with the closing distance, the cause of the sound became extremely clear. There was a large javelin-like object jutting from the wagon's body, piercing through its northern-facing side, its form puncturing through the wheel as well, effectively rendering it useless. The ox stepped forward and laid both of his meaty hands on the object. He proceeded to pull, all of his veins popping and his muscles straining as he put all of his strength into this. Elias involuntarily gasped when he heard the sound of wood splintering. With this harsh sound, the ox stopped moving immediately.
"Shit,"
the bulky man muttered. The impact side of the object was buckling the more the mercenary strained to get this object out. If he had succeeded, it would have likely collapsed the wagon's foundation. The meaty, callous hands of the ox released this object swiftly, and he, instead, reached for his axe.
"All right, we're doing this the good old way."
The ox's axe sounded off as it exited its scabbard, nearly mimicking the sound of the wagon's back window opening. A tiny slit window showed the beady eyes of their contractor.
"What's happening back there?"
His eyes darted to each mercenary standing within his vision, which consisted only of Elias, the Acciari woman, who appeared seemingly out of nowhere, and the short hammer-wielding man, who Elias hadn't seen at all until now.
"What was that sound?"
There was silence. Elias looked at the ox, awaiting his words, but all he did was shrug. Oddly enough to the young mercenary, it was the Acciari, who he hadn't even noticed return to the group, that spoke up. "It appears that someone's seen fit to shoot a rather large harpoon or something of the sort through your wheel, Sir Boss," she shouted. The merchant immediately went into a frenzied panic.
"Well, what am I paying you thugs for? Find out where it came from, now!"
The mercenaries were just getting prepared to embark on a hunt for the source, before a calm male voice seemed to present them with what they sought. "Allow me to save you some time," this voice shouted from the woods to Elias's right. "Put down your weapons. We've business to do, I believe." The only person who seemed to recognize the voice was the merchant, who appeared to be mouthing the word "no" repeatedly in his seat.
No, I have no business with you, no business! Mercenaries, kill this slimy elf cock!
Elias looked in the direction of this voice and saw savage yellow eyes glistening in the dark. The rattle of metal boots, paced with method and measurement, echoed through the forest behind. Astonishingly, such sounds were muffled until now. He immediately shivered, reminded of the piercing white gaze of his past specters. As the figure drew closer, his features became more clear, and his bright yellow eyes still bore into all parties before him. He walked with the calmness of a trained and controlled individual. His body was adorned in dark, jagged armor, and on his head rested a crown-like helmet, crested with the mark of a slashed eye of a similar dark metal, revealing a pallid face below. A deep purple robe, which appeared to have an underlayer of chainmail, flowed down his legs from under his breastplate. But above all, the most apparent thing that he wore was an arrogant smirk. "I would strongly recommend not doing that," laughed the armored Acciari, who was, now in the clear moonlight, apparently very tall. He waved a jagged gauntlet, and a small group of similarly armored soldiers appeared around him from the nearby woods, adorned with full face masks and hooked spears. The mercenaries were all frozen in place, each of them with their weapons at the ready, except for the golden-haired woman. Finally, the first mercenary leapt into action. The ox shouted stubbornly and defiantly,
"I'ma wipe that smug smile off your filthy old face!"
before rushing, axe raised, at the lead Acciari. This individual raised a hand to his soldiers, his cruel smile only widening into a sadistic grin. The soldiers lowered their spears slightly and spread out. The lead commander, in a show of unexpected dexterity, drew 2 barbed swords out from their sheaths resting on his belt. In a flash of silver, the man sidestepped and cut the ox's right arm off with a single swing, his jagged blade seeming to slide cleanly through flesh and bone, sounding quite similar to that of cutting disembodied meat. The arm fell uselessly to the ground with a thud. The ox stopped, dropping his axe, and stared at his separated arm. A low tone began to build from his throat to the tip of his tongue. one that would become a scream in a moment if the Achiari leader didn't act again. There was another flash of silver, and all that could be heard from the ox was a sound that could only be described as both squeaking and gurgling. The large mercenary dropped to his knees and fell, lifeless. Elias could not pull his eyes away, as gruesome as it was. He was frozen in place by suffocating fear. As he stared at the carnage that lay before him, the armored Achiari eyed him with a look of expectation. The gaze lingered for but a moment before a rattle of chains could be heard as a flail appeared within Elias's vision. The Achiari moved with dexterity once again, sidestepping the oncoming flail. In what seemed to be the same movement, his blade flashed silver, and the head of the heavy, flail-wielding man rolled off of his broad shoulders with a spray of blood, followed by his body crumbling to the ground. A battle shout could be heard distantly, and Elias turned to see the short man with the hammer. He met his gaze just as a crossbow bolt punctured his skull with a wet crack in the center of his forehead. With a sound of hard contact, the man fell immediately, his momentum carrying him a few paces forward through the dirt. The young mercenary slowly turned back to face the Achiari leader. The individual wore a sardonic grin on his face, one of his soldiers wielding an elaborate crossbow behind him. There was a terrible silence for several moments. The man looked at Elias with expectation. Finally, the armored aggressor broke the silence, speaking in a tone laden with both surprise and arrogance. "You're not going to throw your life away, then, Komurasi? Surprising. I thought your kind incapable of reason." His gaze shifted to the Achiari woman beside Elias, his yellow eyes piercing into her. "Nor you, Westnieri. I suppose that doesn't surprise me. Where is the one that hired you?" Elias tried to speak, but his voice was strangled by terror. His mouth moved, but no words escaped. The fire-eyed leader watched Elias's mouth move fruitlessly, before finally turning to his soldiers and muttering something in his own language. The soldiers hurried off in different directions with a rattle of chainmail and jagged plates. His gaze slowly turned back to Elias and the golden-haired woman, eyes of searing fire burning into their souls with purpose and amusement.